Welcome to Trinity Baptist Church podcast entitled, Jesus Brings Abundant Life, where we explore how Jesus' teachings offer us more than just words, they offer us life in full. Over the next 6 weeks, we'll dive deep into John 6, unpacking how Jesus reveals himself through signs, dialogue, and teaching. Today, we set the stage by examining the fourth sign in John's Gospel, the feeding of the 5,000. This isn't just about a miracle. It's about how Jesus meets our deepest needs, both physical and spiritual. Stay with us as we explore how these ancient stories speak to our lives today. So enjoy our podcast and please like and subscribe.
And Jesus brings abundant life. So let's set the stage for today and for the next 6 weeks. First of all, John 6, the chapter. You see on the slide how I've mentioned for you that John has a pattern in his gospel. John presents a sign or a miracle. John generally calls them signs. You heard in Paul's reading, the crowd was following him because of signs of healing that Jesus performed, and then they misinterpreted the sign of the feeding of the multitude. So John presents a sign, and that's a story. That's a demonstration. And then the sign or the miracle is followed by dialogue and discourse, the teaching. And through this process, Jesus reveals himself in deeds, in practice, and then in words. And frequently we focus just on the miracle or the sign, and we leave out Jesus' discussion and explanation and elaboration on what you saw, his first audience, and what we just read about, and what it means, and its significance. And sometimes, as we'll see as we walk through John 6, the dialogue and discourse becomes a demonstration in and of itself. I'll go ahead and give you a quick, not really spoiler alert, but part of that demonstration we're going to see that the more Jesus talks, the huge crowds that were following him start to dwindle. And that in and of itself is a demonstration of how people respond frequently to Jesus' message. This is the fourth sign in John's Gospel. It's still relatively early in the book of John, but it's the fourth of 7 or 8, depending on exactly how you count the signs that John recounts. You may recall the wedding feast at Cana, where Jesus responded to his mother Mary's request or concern over the lack of wine at the wedding festival. And you may recall, if you have a really good memory, that I preached on that sign or that miracle about a year ago, and the message there was that God and Jesus cares about what we care about. And I think that's, again, important to this abundant life. Jesus came to give us life to the full. And part of that means caring about what we care about. And then there's the sign of healing the royal official or the government official's son who was very near death. That's one of the signs of healing that John referred to in the first verse that Paul read for us. And then in chapter 5, the immediately preceding chapter, again, a relatively lengthy chapter where Jesus heals a man who couldn't walk. And when the man gets up and walks and carries his mat that he'd been laying on while begging, he was chastised for carrying something on the Sabbath. And that gets into a discourse between the religious officials and Jesus about just who do you think you are in Jesus. And that's where we arrive today. Jesus has been in Jerusalem. He's had a dispute with the religious authorities about who do you think you are. And now Jesus works toward answering that question with a sign and discourse. And that's where we'll be over the next 6 weeks. And I'll mention that the psalm that we read today also gives us a hint. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. God's gracious love, God's free love endures forever. And as the psalmist said, you have become my salvation. God saves. Jesus saves. Jesus is an example of God's steadfast love that never ends, that endures forever. And we'll close today by looking at how we should join the psalmist in giving thanks for God's steadfast love shown through Jesus. Next week, and actually in another coming week, we'll be examining Jesus revealing who he is, specifically by saying, I am. And I'm going to leave it at that. You say, I am what? Well, we shall see. Next week, it's I am. And we'll see the significance of that, but where we're also shooting for later on in the discourse where Jesus says, I am the bread of life. You may have wondered, why are we singing about bread? Well, we've got the miracle of the bread multiplied to feed thousands, and now we have Jesus saying, I am the bread of life, and breaking that bread. And I think many of us are familiar with Jesus saying, I am the bread of life, but notice that's at John 6, verse 35. That's only halfway through the chapter. Jesus continues to talk about what exactly that means, even to the point of saying, you are literally to eat my flesh as that bread. So that's where we're going. We're aiming to unpack layer by layer the significance of this feeding of the multitude. So to set the stage now for today, let's look at our text, the feeding of the 5,000. Interestingly, this is the only miracle that appears in all 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and Mark liked it so much that they told another account of feeding of a multitude, the feeding of the 4,000. So it's a big deal in Scripture. And it demonstrates visually, I might even say viscerally, how God, through Jesus, meets our basic human needs, physical and spiritual. We'll only touch on the spiritual today. That's going to be in the next 5 weeks. That's for the dialogue and the discourse, where Jesus will unpack the spiritual provision that the sign, the miracle, hints at. But another reason that I mentioned visceral is understand, first of all, Jesus saw the crowds and knew they were hungry. Now, most of us, when it gets about our mealtime, we get a little hungry, don't we? We know that it's time to eat, but most of us here today, at least most of the time, have a refrigerator full of food. And maybe a freezer full of food. At the very least, we have some funds, either paper or plastic, in our pockets to go get food or to order it on Grubhub or DoorDash. These people frequently didn't know where their next food was coming from. But Jesus saw the need and moved to meet it. I mentioned that this is the only miracle appearing in all four Gospels. There's a couple of things I want to point out up front that John mentions, John's distinctives, that aren't in the other stories. They aren't in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. First of all, there's geography and calendar mentioned by John. The geography is, he says that it's by the Sea of Tiberias. That's a Roman name for the Sea of Galilee, referring to the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Now, maybe that's just John covering all the bases and talking in Greek and in Roman. But theologically, and especially in context of the people wanting to make Jesus king, I think John's calling our attention to earthly rulers, to the powers that be. Remember, Jesus had just quarreled with the religious leaders, and now John is getting ready to tell us that the people want Jesus to become a political leader, a king. So John mentions the location, the geography, Sea of Tiberias, to remind us of the Roman Empire and earthly kings. And he mentions the calendar, the Passover festival. And there's a number of parallels to Moses, because remember, Moses participated in what? The very first Passover, where God liberated the slaves from Egypt. There's testing here. Scripture tells us that Jesus asked Philip, "Where shall we get food?" And notice Jesus said, "Where shall we get food?" He didn't say, "Should we feed?" Jesus said, "We will meet the needs of these people." Philip, where can we buy bread? And understand also that testing in Scripture, and this is the same word that's sometimes translated temptation as well. So temptation and testing tend to go together. God never tempts, but sometimes God can use temptation to increase our faith, and God uses testing also to increase our faith. Jesus asked Philip where to get bread to feed, because although he already had a plan, he wanted to involve Philip and allow Philip's faith to be expanded. And of course, Andrew's faith as well, because remember, Andrew brought along the little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and notice John stresses small loaves and small fish for these starving people. Also, Jesus sits down on a mountainside. Moses went up a mountain. In fact, the key figure of Moses, or maybe the 2 key figures we think of with Moses in connection with the Passover or the Exodus, is what? The sea and the mountain, Mount Sinai. So Jesus, or God, through John, is drawing parallels to Moses from Jesus. Notice too that while Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about grass, John says there was lots of grass. In contrast to the small loaves and the small fishes, there was lots of grass. Now again, maybe that's John just being literary and liking to add adjectives. But I think it's probably a precursor to John chapter 10, where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I lead my sheep out into green pastures to feed. Here, there's lots of grass, green pastures, lush fields, abundance provided by Jesus as Jesus feeds his sheep. In John 10, the Good Shepherd says, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. Isn't it interesting how Scripture all fits together? Don't just grab one little word or one little verse out of context. Look at the whole story. And we want to do that so we don't miss the point. The people missed the point. They had their tummies filled. But we too miss the point. Let's start by asking the question today and the question in coming weeks. What does this bread have to teach me today? Now, you're probably scratching your head saying, all right, Si, where on earth did that come from? Well, first of all, remember, we have 5 loaves of bread. What are they going to teach us today? And Jesus is going to unpack this metaphor of bread and being the bread of life. What does Jesus as bread have to teach us today? But I have to confess, I wasn't original enough to come up with that. There's a blog on the Luther Seminary Working Preacher website this month. Actually, it's the end of July, talking about this series of scriptures out of John chapter 6. And it's written by a theologic reflector. I don't believe she's actually a minister, but she writes on theological themes, and she also makes bread. And she literally talks about how the act of making bread brings to life this meaning of what Jesus as bread of life means to us, what the metaphor can bring to us. And she talks in the blog about how getting your fingers in means a lot. Also talks about how, in specific connection with this text, that there's no better way to understand it than by actually baking bread, because it's not just a metaphor but a tangible means of knowing God in our hands and tasting God in our mouth. And remember, Jesus is going to talk about eating the bread of life later on. Bread is incredibly simple, oftentimes just 4 ingredients, she says, but at the same time, it's infinitely complex. It's a difficult skill to master. I've made bread a little bit. I've looked at some recipes for bread, and I don't know if any of you had, but as she reiterates, all sorts of things can impact the recipe and how it turns out. The humidity in the air, the age and humidity of the flour, the elevation of where you are when you bake it. So a simple subject, bread, 4 ingredients, can be amazingly complex. So let's ask, what does this bread have to teach me today? And we'll start by recognizing that the people who ate Jesus' sign, ate Jesus' multiplied miracle, missed the point. They said, Jesus is a prophet. They saw the parallels between Moses and Jesus that I mentioned, the mountaintops, the second Exodus. They saw that. They made that connection. God promised in Exodus to bring a new prophet like Moses. And they said Jesus is a prophet. They recognized Jesus as that new prophet like Moses. And like Moses, they saw Jesus as a prophet to liberate them. But they saw Jesus liberating in the military sense, overthrowing the Romans. Remember the geography that John talked about? Emperor Tiberius, the Sea of Tiberius. The people wanted Jesus to be a king, and Jesus says, and retreats where? To a mountain. Where's Moses go when he needs to be with God? To a mountain. There's another parallel with Moses. But Jesus would have no part of the misunderstanding. But before we are too cruel or too cynical toward the people who ate Jesus' miracle, isn't our view of God and Jesus' work sometimes distorted today? Sometimes don't we get focused on our immediate desires and how Jesus can meet our immediate desires that we lose sight of what God is doing in the bigger sense? There's a song that comes to mind right now, and I'm sorry I don't have the title to it, but it's pretty close to this. But it talks about, help me to want the giver more than the gift. All too often, we go to God, we go to Jesus for what Jesus can give us or do for us, rather than for who Jesus and who God is. And what we can do, not just for God, but with Jesus. Part of that abundant life that Jesus came to bring is a fruitful life, a productive life, a life of ministry empowered by Jesus. Jesus gives to those in need. Jesus calls us to join him in giving to those in need. We've been fed by God's grace. We've been fed by God's mercy and care and steadfast love, as the psalmist says. And like the psalmist, we are called to proclaim God's steadfast love and to let others know about God's grace in our deeds as well as our words. That's the message. Let's not miss it. Jesus is our companion too. And we'll unpack this idea a little bit more next week and perhaps in coming weeks. But I want to introduce this idea that our relationship with God, that this Chapter 6 story of feasting on Jesus is all about relationship. Alex has been doing a series on his Dirty Christianity podcast on truth and how Jesus is the truth. As I was preparing for this series of sermons, I ran across a quotation of a scholar that says, truth is not a concept that, quote, works. In other words, truth isn't a thing that does things, but an incarnation that lives. Remember that kneading bread and what can this bread teach us? Remember, at least up until the time where it's placed in the oven and baked bread is a living organism. The yeast that's bringing out the gluten in the flour and the carbon dioxide that gives bulk and heft to the bread. Jesus is an incarnation. Jesus, John tells us, is truth. But Jesus is truth not as a thing, but as an incarnation. An incarnation that lives. The Word became flesh, incarnate, in human form, and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. We'll be unpacking that a bit more. And remember that Jesus came to bring abundant life. John 10:10. I came not to kill and destroy, but that they may have life and have it abundantly. And back for just a moment to John's geography and calendar. Another scholar said, referencing this idea of earthly rulers of the Roman Empire, the biggest empire in the world in Jesus' day, coupled with this idea of God freeing God's people, says that John is trying to let us know that there's a worldwide drama involving Gentiles and Jews, a drama of universal human need, physical and spiritual, and God's care for that need. And you thought that this was just all about 5 loaves and 2 fishes and 5,000 people, didn't you? And maybe throw in the 12 baskets left over at the end. That's why John goes on for 71 verses. There's a lot here that we want to look at and unpack. But the question that we need to ask ourselves in light of that worldwide drama, the drama of Jews and Gentiles all coming together in need, looking for answers to their need that God can give us, let's ask ourselves, how can we proclaim God's care for human physical and spiritual needs and work with God in meeting those needs? Remember how I said sometimes we get so focused on the stuff going on around us and what Jesus can do for us, we forget that God calls us to act with Jesus to meet needs of those around us. And interestingly enough, frequently when we reach out and meet others' needs, what happens? Our own needs get met, both physically and spiritually, but especially spiritually. Jesus is our teacher. Jesus sat down on a mountainside. John doesn't use the word teach, but that's what rabbis, teachers did in Jesus' day, in the first century, was they would sit down and begin to teach. Maybe Jesus sitting on a mountain comes to mind in another story, the Sermon on the Mount. Clearly, Jesus teaching, and that's what Jesus was doing when he tested Philip. He wasn't trying to give Philip an exam and grading A to F. Jesus was inviting Philip into that worldwide drama that we just talked about meeting human needs. Philip, how can we meet the needs of these people? And of course, what was the ultimate answer to both Philip, who said, it'd take 6 months of work for everybody to have just a bite. And Andrew, who said, all I've got is 5 little loaves and 5 little fish, or 2 little fishes? The answer was Jesus. I am. More to come. So where do we want to leave it today? I keep talking about more to come, and there is more to come. We've just looked briefly at the sign today. Over the next 5 weeks, we'll unpack the sign as Jesus explains what it means fully. But what can we grasp right now? What can this bread teach us right here, right now? And I'll leave you with this. Give it all to Jesus. It's easy to get discouraged, both individually and as a church. Paul talked, 3 weeks ago now, on how we are unique here at Trinity, in how we reach out and welcome everyone, how, as the choir sang, we join Jesus in inviting people to come just as you are. We are all broken. We're all broken in some way right now this morning, I suspect. We may be a little higher on the scale of mountaintop experiences, or we may be very low in the valley, but we all have worries and concerns. Barb mentioned some of them. Even if they're not us personally, we can look at the news and get worried and fearful and broken. We come here to Jesus to be mended, and the way we can be mended is, first of all, coming as we are and giving all of ourselves to Jesus. That was Jesus, the teacher in the test. Jesus said, yeah, you don't have 6 months' wages. That wouldn't do a whole lot. You got 5 loaves and 2 little fish. Give it to me. Give it to me. Give yourself to me. God promises to be with us no matter what. God promises to make us fruitful. And even if the promise looks like it's delayed, it's not denied. So dwell on what we have rather than what we don't have, and give it all to Jesus and let Jesus do the rest. I learned it this way, and I've described it sometimes from the pulpit, how I learned in the rooms of recovery to take the life one step at a time, one day at a time. Do the next right thing. Ask God, what do you have for me to do right now? And do it and leave the results to Jesus. We can't do it ourselves. With Jesus, we can do everything. And then give thanks in all circumstances. Paul says that a couple of times, and that's the Apostle Paul, not Reverend Paul, in his letters, where he says, pray about everything, or give thanks, and pray about everything with thanksgiving, and then give thanks in all circumstances. In this text, Jesus twice gives thanks. Paul stresses, or John stresses, that Jesus gives thanks. But just because the people misunderstood that Jesus wasn't called to be a political king, doesn't mean Jesus isn't a king. For we know this side of the cross that Jesus is our king. It's just that his kingdom is not earthly. Jesus came to bring God's reign to earth. Menotti wrote a one-act opera called A Mall and the Night Visitors. And one of the characters, Melchior, spoke of the child king in the opera this way: the child we seek, this is a Christmas opera, the child we seek doesn't need our gold. On love alone, he will build his kingdom. His pierced hand will hold no scepter, his haloed head will wear no crown, his might will not be built on your toil. Swifter than lightning, he soon will walk among us. He will bring us new life and receive our death, and the keys to his city belong to the poor. We serve a risen Jesus, a risen King, our bread of life, who came to give us abundant life. That's the good news for us, and especially for us to share with a world in need.